Good morning. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm apparently live. You can see the screens over there. I'm Gavin Wyman. I am a legal consultant with Wyman Legal Consulting. I am a trainer and a facilitator on engineering and construction contracts, which include the FIDIC forms, the NEC forms, the JBCC forms, and the GCC forms. Welcome again to this webinar called Contractually Speaking. This particular slot is called FIDIC Fridays. It starts at 9 o'clock, it ends at 9:45. I then edit the streams for uploading to my Facebook page, my YouTube site, and people can view them there later. What we dealt with last Friday, and by the way, last Friday's webinar has been edited and has been uploaded if you want to have a look at it there, is we went very briefly through some of the slides, and let me simply recap a little of what we did. You will not see me here, you will see me disappear in the process. I just need to get my cursor there, sorry. So we had a look at the meaning of FIDIC, the organization itself, where they come from, their website, their addresses. We had a look at this specific slide, and we spent a bit of time commenting on the role of the engineer, and attempted to contradict the notion that the employer makes variations. And we highlighted an interesting, somewhat controversial feature, namely that the engineer actually has, under the common law of contract relating to consulting contracts, South African law terms it a mandate. We have a situation where the engineer is actually supposed to act impartially and independently with a duty of trust, fiduciary duty to the client, to act in the client's best interest to bring the contract to a conclusion. This naturally is implied then by the common law that he has the full authority to act on behalf of the client, subject only to the terms of the consulting contract, which may be, for example, a FIDIC White Book that limits this authority and might require him to obtain permission. We had a look at the terms of a FIDIC contract as well, that stated that any withdrawing of authority by the professional services contract would have to be told or brought to the attention of the contractor in the particular conditions of contract. The situation is not dissimilar to that which one would find in the JBCC building contract, for example. The other thing we're going to haven't queued up yet is, of course, the contract itself, and I'm going to do that as well. Just a moment. I just want to open the FIDIC Scrivener files so that we can have a look at the contract this morning if we want to as well. That's busy opening at the moment. And that sort of brought us to the end of an hour last week on Friday, and we will continue with this talk, with this live streamed webinar. That was the sort of example of the Red Book. This is the use case of the contract, what you use them for. So the Red Book is used, as you can see, for typical projects, infrastructure, buildings, hydropower, processing plants. In South Africa, the FIDIC Red Book is being used to build the Kusile Power Station, which some people say, why? Because surely Eskom, as everybody knows, is committed to using the NEC suite of contracts, which is true. However, one of the features of FIDIC is that it was adopted by the World Bank. They have this pink book, sort of. It used to be the situation that if you borrowed money from the World Bank, they would lend it to you on condition that you would use a FIDIC form of contract. This remains the situation. They will also now consider NEC contracts, but FIDIC has always been the World Bank's go-to contract because of, as we discussed, the international drafting committees that contribute to FIDIC, making it fairly useful for contracts that happen in an international setting where different legal systems may apply. We can talk a bit about how FIDIC interacts with different legal systems, maybe in a later talk. So the Red Book is used, as you can see, where the design is provided to the contractor, or at least the substantial major part of it. On this particular topic, one might want to add an interesting aside. The second edition of the contract, the FIDIC 2 or the 2017 edition, is approximately 25% longer than the 1999 first edition. The 1999 first edition does not have an awful lot to say about the contractor's design. More or less it says the contractor is responsible for that part of the design that the specification says he is responsible for. Part of the reason, or the increasing length of the second edition, is that just about every reference, and there's hundreds of them, to the works or section now also includes in the second edition all the contractor's design, if any, and adds design clauses, making the new Red Book sort of fill a space a little bit further along the design cliff than the original 1999 first edition. So one could argue that the new Red Book, the second edition Red Book, is a contract that provides more elements for a contractor's design than does the first edition. So having said that, just bear that in mind. Just want to get this more across here. Sorry, just a moment. We could have a look, for example, at something along those lines. We will in a moment as well. Don't know why I've got the Medupi Red Book shown up, but any Red Book will do, I suppose. Okay, good. So the Yellow Book, as you can see from the slide, is used where the employer provides the design, not the contractor. The lengthy, long title they have, Conditions of Contract for Plant and Design Build for Electrical and Mechanical Plant and for Building and Engineering Works designed by the contractor. So here the contractor provides the design. The short name for it, as you can see, that they give is Plant and Design Build Contract, and then they often shorten it even further to simply the initials P and DB, particularly, for example, in the contracts guide. Now, what's different about this is the way in which the scope of work is written. In the Red Book, the scope of work is called the specification, and the definition of the specification is basically a document entitled specification, which is rather restricting. Sorry, let me just cue it up here so that I can quote it to you. Contract. So specification means a document entitled specification as included in the contract, and any additions and modifications to the specification in accordance with the contract. Then actually the definition follows with a short sentence. Such document specifies the works. Just on a further aside, I see I'm going from one loop to another loop to another loop. The reason I said this is restrictive is that if your document has a different title, and I've seen this many times, for example, instead of including a document in the list of contractual instruments, don't have a contract because there's no agreement that provides for work. To provide for work is an essential element of an agreement, the agreed work or determinable work, and without it, the contract lacks sufficient particularity to be a contract at all. And this is incredibly dangerous. So make sure that you include in the contract agreement, literally, a document entitled Specification. Remember, the part of the contract we are speaking about here, let me show you quickly. A quick transition to this particular page. Now the transitions aren't working for some reason. Hitting the wrong button. So there's me with a FIDIC contract in the background, or me in the corner as it were, and the contract there. Sorry, maybe I'm off the screen or something like this. Not 100% sure what you're seeing here with the desktops are set up correctly. Seems it's set up sufficiently. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to there we go. So where were we? I've now lost my train of thought. Wow. This is not as easy as it appears when you see other people effortlessly doing webinars. Oh, the contract agreement portion of it. So yeah, something along these lines. Contract agreement. So the agreement one finally signs when you enter into a FIDIC contract looks something like this, and the definition means the specification included in the contract, and there is a mistake. You could simply rectify this by agreement and do a little amendment or an addendum to the contract. But what happens if the other party has second thoughts about the contract and says, sorry, this is a void or valid contract and cannot be enforced, and gets out of the project that way? People often have cause to want to get out of contracts. So back to our slideshow. Now I hope this is streaming correctly. Let me try and have a quick look. Sorry. Streaming correctly. I'm not sure if we're back to the slideshow properly or we're still with me here, but we should have transitioned back to the slides. There we go. Sorry about that. I might have to edit that out slightly in the posted version later. So looking at the yellow book, the second thing we see is that the specification here now is different. It's called, in fact, the employer's requirement in the yellow book. It's not called the specification, and also it has to be named that specific way. So again, let me show you the definition of a employer's requirements in a yellow book. I'm calling the contract up again just to get the definition on screen before I show you it. Gosh, there we go, yellow book. And the definition we will find, we may as well watch what I'm doing here. The definition we will find is over here in the definitions, the contract, and we will have a definition employer's requirement over here. And what is the definition? Employer's requirement means the document entitled employer's requirements as included in the contract, which means in the contract agreement. So make sure in the list of documents that make up the contract agreement, you have a document entitled the employer's requirements and not some other name like the employer's requirements and blah, 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 because now it's got a different title to the title required by the definition. The pernicketyness of FIDIC, if you want to call it that, putting you in a straitjacket of taxonomy or words that you are told to use in essence, and if you don't, you have the risk of having a improperly formed contract. There are better ways of doing it than this. For example, the NEC method, which simply says the scope of works is in a document the data says it's in, and then you're not linked to having a straitjacket, but now you are linked to making sure that you complete the data correctly to identify the document in which the scope of work is to be found. Now, if we have a look again at this, we will see it goes further. It also includes any additions or modifications to such document in accordance with the contract. I can't recall if the specification in the Red Book made provision for amendments in its definition. Let's have a quick look there. The specification means the document included. Yes, it does. And any additions or modifications in accordance with the contract. So how would one do additions and modifications to the specifications? Well, the obvious way would be by a variation within the scope of what variations allow. But I suppose another way would be to do a simple addendum to the contract, a contractual amendment initialed and signed by the principals who have authority to amend the contract. Again, such document specifies the works, is what the Red Book says, and what the Yellow Book says is that the employer's requirements. Such document specifies the purpose, scope, and or design, and or other technical criteria for the works. But if one has a look at the slide that we're looking at on our other screen over here, you will see that they call this an outcome or performance specification. So the difference in essence is that the specification in the Red Book tells the contractor in great detail what he is to do. He will normally, like a building contract, have a whole series of drawings that describe the elevation, the work, the floor layout, almost a blueprint for how the work is to be done. So you can have a little bit of that in the Yellow Book because the definition says it might also specify some design elements and other technical requirements, how to do certain things. But the essence of a outcome or performance specification is that the specification tells the contractor to design some facility that will be able to perform certain functions in various performance levels after he's designed and built it that the employer wants. It is then up to a contractor to provide a design that will meet these specific functional and performance requirements. I suppose in a very dumbed down way of putting it, the specification would say, design and build me a power station that generates X gigawatts. That is an outcome. The contractor can then design something with water cooling towers or air cooling towers, with just one turbine or 100 turbines or whatever he wants, provided the outcome is met, namely that when we switch on the power station, if it was as simple as that, X gigawatts was put out. So this is of course problematic. So also with design build contracts, you may want to know what kind of design the contractor has in mind. So very often the contract is required with his tender to submit a thumbnail sketch, methodology, a statement or something along those lines, so that the employer can see what kind of methodology is going to be used basically by the contractor in his design, what his approach is. That way one can compare different prices for water cooling power stations and others for air cooling power stations and different design features. I mean, you might be able to design a 70 gigawatt power station in a very archaic, old-fashioned manner. It's difficult to maintain, for example. the other way is to solve that problem would be to make it part of the outcome that states that design and build me a power station that generates X gigawatts, but then at the second set a separate outcome. The separate or secondary outcome could be, and that will operate within the following maintenance range for a period of 30 years. Now understand, the first thing is, with any specification, one has to find a way later of verifying that what you've asked for, what you've commissioned, is in fact delivered. It doesn't matter whether it's a red book or a yellow book. So FIDIC will at a later stage have a taking over phase, and the specifications might also specify the tests that have to be passed in order to satisfy the completion requirements, the takeover requirements, and then a taking over certificate is issued. Same thing would happen with a yellow book. These would be tests on completion and tests after completion, and ways of verifying that the design has met the specific requirement. Now do understand that just because the contractor is providing the design in the yellow book, it doesn't mean that he can simply design something and build it without having that design approved to some extent or accepted by the employer. You must be able to at least say, yep, it seems okay, go ahead, sort of a check and balance on it, and that the yellow book does provide for that kind of process. But the fundamental difference is, of course, the design and the assessment criteria to verify that the outcomes, performances are met in the design when the taking over and the testing is done. And then if we have to operate within a maintenance capacity for 10 or 20 years, we may have to have tests after completion run at specific intervals over the next 10 to 20 years to verify that this power station is maintainable within the price range, etc. All right, sorry about that interruption. Some message came in on my cell phone. This is not a sort of face-to-face kind of lecture where one normally switches cell phones off until tea time. So it's kind of a live show, and I apologize for that. So yeah, the next thing on the slide is, of course, the idea that this is still a managed contract. So the red book and the yellow book have this in common, that there is a fully detailed role for a contract manager and administrator called an engineer who acts on behalf of the employer and who does the management and administration of the contract, issuing notices, issuing signing off interim payment certificates, signing taking over certificates and completion certificates, and doing all the work and administrative actions that the contract needs. And the other fundamental difference is that in the red book you could do pricing in two different ways. The first way you could do pricing in a red book would be on a lump sum basis. In other words, let's assume again a power station, that the price for building X, whether it's a red book in a red book contract, the price for building a power station is $20 million or $1 billion, whatever the case might be. The contractor is then required to build the power station for an all-in lump sum price specified in the contract. This is the only exception would be is if there's a variation. So provided there's no variation or change, the contractor will not be able to extend the price. And if he has incorrectly priced it, that will be his loss. In other words, lump sum contracts place cost risk and estimation risk very squarely on the shoulders of a contractor. The other pricing mechanism found in the red book is also a fixed pricing, in the sense of a lump sum contract being a fixed price contract, except it's not an all-in fixed price. This is, of course, the well-known bill of quantities, BOQ, where you are pricing the inputs. You're pricing the brickwork, the steel work, the building work, and you are breaking it down into unit prices. So a unit of paving might be $2 or $3 per so many square foot, or per meter, or whatever measuring tool you'll use. They often do use standard measuring systems put out by professional bodies. For builders, I know they use the Association of Quantity Surveyors methodologies. There are various British colonies where we have quantity surveying as a distinct profession. I'm not sure if that applies in the US. I understood it's only a more recently discovered discipline. But anyway, it's still a fixed pricing contract because the rate per unit of paving is fixed. The only difference is that the quoted price in the tender is an estimate. It's based on the assumption that the extraction of the quantities from the drawings by the quantity surveyor is accurate. And when the work is actually done in a bill of quantities contract, we measure the actual work done. So the actual square feet of earth removed, the actual square feet, or the actual amount of paving done. We times that amount of paving by the rate for paving, and that is what the contract is paid. So they often call a bill of quantities contract a remeasurable contract or an admeasurable contract, and they often talk about a bill of quantities as being provisional in that sense. But it's still fixed pricing when it comes down to it. All right, so let's move on. The next contract in the realm of FIDIC is the Silver Book. Now, the Silver Book and the Yellow Book have in common the notion that the contractor is providing the design. But in what way is this then different from the Yellow Book? Well, the difference is that in the Silver Book there is no fully developed role for an engineer at all. There is a one-liner in the contract that says the employer may appoint a representative to administer the contract on his behalf. And one could take that one-liner and in particular conditions rewrite the complete role of the Red or Yellow Book engineer into this contract. But the whole idea is you shouldn't be doing that. This contract is used for a different purpose. This contract is used where a contractor is simply going to design, build a thing, deliver you the keys at the end of the process. The employer should not need to be involved. He should not need to have an engineer. It should be simply checking that the work has reached a certain stage and paying payment certificates, etc. And you will use this where there is low perceived risk. So it's quite important here that the contractor is going to simply take all responsibility. He's even going to warrant the correctness of the employer's requirements. So you would have to very carefully scrutinize the employer's requirements before submitting an offer. If you were a contractor, you may even have to raise clarification questions before forming the contract in the Silver Book. And you would have to be 100% satisfied that you understand in exact detail what the employer wants and that you can provide this without any risk for a lump sum price. Because in Yellow Book and Silver Book, prices are lump sums always. Whereas when in the Red Book, you can have bill of quantities, you can have a lump sum, but in the Yellow Book and the Silver Book, you're always going to have a lump sum, no bill of quantities. So that's a very, very important distinction. The second important distinction between yellow and silver is that in the yellow book, after you've submitted a tender, you have as a contractor, you have an envelope, a period of time for you to ask questions and raise clarifications about the employer's requirement. And then the engineer will respond to those. And if you have pointed out a hole in the employer's requirements, the engineer would have to repair that hole with a variation, which would be priced. That does not happen at all in the Silver Book. So the Silver Book has to have everything pre-negotiated, clarified before, so when the contract is signed, the contractor warrants that the employer's requirements are full, proper, complete in all respects, and if they're not, that is his risk, and any changes to fix that would come out of his lump sum. A very dangerous thing for a contractor to do. So the indicative use of the Silver Book is often a manufacture to order type project. For example, I know that Siemens are often considered to be contractors to build transformers, but to a large extent Siemens already have very clear blueprints for their transformers. They just don't build them and put them on the shelf for you to come pick up one. So you will go along to Siemens and you'll say, I want your model X, and then they will start manufacturing it and deliver it. A Silver Book could be used precisely in that kind of manufacture to order or manufacture on demand type of contract. Siemens build transformers in their sleep, so to them they don't foresee any risk. The specification is their own specification, so that the employer makes that his outcome, give us that model, which is an outcome, or which with all the performances written into the design of the contractor in this particular case. Here is a perfect example of how the Silver Book could be used. Now, the other issue that seems to have arisen in the industry is the attempt by employers who like the fact that the Silver Book places all the risk on the contractor to use the Silver Book in situations where there is high risk. So they still wanted to manage the contractor, to micromanage him if necessary, but to place all the risk on him. So they use the Silver Book as a proxy for the Yellow Book. They rewrite into it a contractor oversight role by an engineer, and they try and put the risk of the Silver Book on the contractor in a contract where the risk should not be put that much on the contractor. Contractors, many of them are aware of this particular problem, so as the employer starts putting oversight on, they try to negotiate other elements out of the Silver Book and make it more a Yellow Book type scenario. So again, I think that's a counterproductive approach to contracting. I think, in my view, in fact, I'm very strongly of this view, you need to do a risk assessment of your project before you begin it. You need to use the risk assessment as the basis for the choice of your contract forms, and you should start with a contract form that is closest to your pre-risk assessment. And then obviously where the contract falls short, the role of particular conditions would come in, and amendments or addendums would be done in particular conditions to make the contract more bespoke, to align it more with the risk of that you have foreseen in your contract. That's sort of then the Silver Book. Now the Green Book is a very interesting little contract. It's intended for work that is less sophisticated or complex. It has no preference for who designs the work, whether it's the contractor or the employer. You can simply put that into the information that relates to the works, the specification. The use case for it, set out on the slide, is fairly simple to understand. The price is usually small, under perhaps $500,000. Or, not and, or alternatively, one could use it where this is a short-term project, one where you may not need price escalation clauses and complexity of that nature, say less than 6 months. Or, again, that's not an and, it could be something that's done over several years, but where the work is basically simple, repetitive, fall over, boringly dead, like dredging as an example given there. So the design is really relevant. It could be done by either party, and it is a very versatile contract. It can literally be used for everything: construction, electrical, mechanical, and so on. Now, this contract is not used as often as one would imagine, and that is because many employers simply lack the capacity, in my view, to administer contracts. So they prefer to go for a contract that has the role of contract administration built into it, and this applies across the board. It's not just a FIDIC issue. It applies with regard to JBCC or building contracts, to NEC contracts, and so on. If someone could write a very neat little management tool to add to the Green Book to provide for that, the Green Book would be far more useful to employers. The administration of the contract could be perhaps at the level of a NEC engineering construction short contract. So the administration by the engineer could also be cut down and simplified for use with the Green Book. I haven't attempted to do something like that for the Green Book, but it would be an interesting exercise in drafting. So that's the Green Book, and that sort of is the use case for the contract. Now, this is a sort of interesting slide because it kind of helps you identify risk and uncertainty issues in contracts, sources, as we say, of uncertainty. Really what we're talking about here is uncertainty and cost or pricing risk. Sorry about that. Sip of coffee, it's getting cold on me here. So obviously one can, if one looks at the bulleted list, one can understand why the bullets would be risky. For example, if one is unsure going into a project what the outcome or result is going to look like, that is a major risk. And it's not that this doesn't happen. I have been involved in, as consultant, do a lot of consulting on contracts, in projects where there are massive delays in getting the work started, and the engineer is trying to blame the contractor. Oh, you don't have an approved program in place yet, or all sorts of excuses. But the true delay is that the engineering hasn't yet been done. They started this project with maybe very high-level drawings or ideas of what they wanted to do, and now that they've got the job, they've caught the bus, they don't know what to do with it, or they are struggling to get the drawings detailed enough so that work can begin. So signing a contract where you don't precisely have the engineering or the drawings or the designs correct can be a massive risk, can cause massive delays, etc. In silver and yellow books particularly, where you are working simultaneously with providing the design, you can get to a massive problem where you get the building to the 4th floor and we suddenly realize that there was something in a basement that was required to be done, and our structures above it aren't going to allow for this, and we have to break down a building and start over. I mean, that could be one would hope people would never do something that's silly, but the silliness and the scope for human folly is never ever going to not happen in the real world. So be careful of that. So that's a very, very high risk. Cost uncertainty is a major risk as well. If you are asking a contractor to give you a lump sum price, for example, if using a yellow or silver book, he now has to go and cost the project his designs or your designs, and if he is not sure what the various input costs are going to be, if they have a variability, he's going to choose the generous side of the cost. He's going to price in the most expensive version of it, because if he prices in a medium or an average or a low, and reality turns out that this costs a lot more, the bricks, the cement, the steel costs more than he projected, well, he has to pay for that out of his pocket. He's only going to get the lump sum price, so any increasing costs are going to come out of his profits. So cost uncertainty has a massive way of increasing the contractor's tender price, because he will price in all cost uncertainty. If he decides to do future buying or hedge buying of the bricks and materials and sources, he will have to cost in the price of that insurance. Technical unknowns, you can understand how this can have a massive risk impact. I always use a silly example of building a tunnel under the English Ocean. When you're doing this for the very, very first time, we don't know if we get to the middle that there's a misalignment, or we don't know that there is a technical risk of a fracture causing flooding of the tunnel, and we haven't perhaps even invented the machine yet to unflood it. These are technical unknowns, things that could bedevil us, particularly underground or when the work is hidden. So these can be major problems. That would be technical unknowns. Time unknowns. How long does it take to do a thing? This is also a massive risk. I remember a elderly retired contractor saying to me over a cognac, I think it was, the way to make money as a contractor is to know how long it takes to do something. I suppose that is simply the ancient wisdom that time is money. The longer it takes to do something, the more you've got to pay additional staff, the taxi meter keeps running, it keeps clocking in, fuel's burning up, etc. So delays are massive time and money risks. A good example of that would be the South African Kusile and Medupi projects. There were schedule uncertainties caused, in their particular case, by labor relations. Apparently, as I understand the story, I wasn't intimately involved in the day-to-day problems. This is reported to me. Different employers were treating their staff differently. Some were giving them lunch packs, some were busing them in, some were expected them to arrive themselves with maybe a travel allowance, and they all felt discriminated against, went on strike for some reason. They did not see themselves as employees of the specific contractor, but all working for Eskom, and why should they be treated differently? And I believe that Eskom was involved in strikes that lasted for up to a year until some sort of harmonized labor relations policy could be put into place, all the particular contracts amended or altered by variations, and this added a fraction of a phenomenal extra amount to the price. I'm told that the current prices, the pricing of these power stations is actually, without them being halfway done, they should theoretically have been able to build 2 power stations with what is being spent at the moment, which is a shocking issue. And that is simply a schedule risk or time-related risk. And it also has an overlap, I suppose, with the last bullet on that list, the sort of idea of behavioral or cultural issues and how they can create risk. So in South Africa, we have certain cultural matters that are part of history. Labor relations seem to fit into that to some extent as well. Our labor force has certain notions conditioned into them, I suppose, by the experiences of the apartheid era. But that's not related. It's not just a South African issue. You will have different cultural issues if you're working in the Middle East or in Asia or in Britain or in America. There's a problem of language and interpretation, Chinese contractors in Africa, and coping with language differences and cultural issues that can cause conflict. Conflict can cause delay, can cause variations, can cause work to be defective or misunderstood, and so on. So all of these risks are high-level risks, and one should ensure that the contract deals with it for your culture and that sufficient amendments to particular conditions are done to deal with as many of these risks as possible. But how does this affect pricing issues? Now, that is important because the problem that FIDIC faces to a large extent is that it only has fixed pricing options. Gosh, we're over time. So 9:45 was our cutoff time. So I'm going to end the course today, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between risk costing, fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable contracts, time-based contracts in the next Contractually Speaking FIDIC Fridays live stream. Please note that an edited version of this week's broadcast will be available on my YouTube video. Again, how do you get hold of it? I'm not 100% sure yet, but you can email me. My email address is Gavin, Gavin, at access, AXXESS.co.za, and I will point you to where you can find these uploaded videos. Sometime in the future, I'm hoping also to invite people to share the platform with me, to react to what I'm saying, to ask questions to what I'm saying, like putting a Zoom meeting or onto the screen and stream live that way, showing also the resources and the slides and the other participants in the talk. Understand that this is part of my learning curve. Anyway, have a great day, and I will see you next week Friday at 9 o'clock.